friends. This is Steve Gutberg. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show, and my guest today is none other. You know this guy. He's a rock star.
Me again.
Andrew Jones from ELAC. And we've done a bunch of these already, so I want to do something we haven't beat to death, and that is speaker break-in, burn-in, etc., etc. Like, is it real? Does it exist? I mean, I think it does. I mean, I know a lot of people say it's in my head or in the listener's head, but I think there's more going on. Am I crazy? Don't answer too quickly.
Yeah. Yes, crazy about this question or crazy in general. So, now there's no doubt that drive units, particularly bass drivers, change with use. Can we define what that usage means? Is it a long time thing? Is it a short time thing? What are the mechanisms that cause the change? And we know for a fact that woofers in particular, and I start with woofers because a woofer you're using through its resonant frequency and below. The resonant frequency defines the low frequency limit of the woofer, but we're playing full range music into it. So it tries to respond below its resonant frequency more or less successfully, depending on the design of the system. Is it a bass reflex? Is it a closed box? But there's no doubt some of the characteristics are defined by how it performs through that resonant frequency. And when we look at what defines the resonant frequency of the woofer, and let's just think free air for the moment, just a woofer sitting there. It's the mass of the moving parts, the coil and the cone and half of the surround and half of the spider and all the glue, plus the air load mass that's on it. So we've got that mass forms a resonant system with the stiffness of the spider plus surround. So the importance of that is mass is unchanging. It's a pretty well defined parameter. Compliance is not unchanging. Compliance, first of all, has a value, a stiffness. So spiders at rest position, and as we move the coil up and back, we're basically stretching the rolls of the spider, and they're resisting and trying to pull back. So that's the springiness of the spider. But that spider is typically made of woven cloth impregnated with a resin. And as it moves, those rolls are starting to stretch tighter and tighter till at the extreme, you could say at the extreme, it would form just a flat cone, or a cone with no ripples in it. Now, we never managed to get a spider going that far. Before it could do so, the surround would have stretched tight, or you'd have crashed the coil into the back of the magnet motor system and buckled it and be very unhappy. And it would be accompanied by loud cracking sounds. So nonetheless, as it stretches further and further, its effective stiffness changes. It gets stiffer and stiffer. So it's a non-linear system. So there's a certain amount of linearity in a woofer defined by, is the coil still totally within the magnetic field? As it starts to move too far, it'll come out of the field and cause all sorts of non-linearities in the drive force, counteracted when you're in the stiffness, around resonant frequency and below, counteracted by the spider stiffness trying to pull it backwards. And they fight each other, and you'll often, in order to try and make sure the coil can't literally jump out of the gap, which in the old days it definitely used to, and of course it would never go back in. So you try and counteract this nonlinear force at the extremes with a negative direction force from the spider that pulls tight enough that it kind of keeps hold of it. So you got this nonlinearity. Now the problem is that nonlinearity, not only is it nonlinear with respect to position, it's nonlinear to a degree with respect to time, both short-term and long-term. So you've got something that we call creep factor. Spiders, any spring system, if you apply a constant force, it should displace to a position where the counteracting force of the spider matches the force that you're applying, and it just stays there. But if you put DC on it and just move it down that position, after a bit of time, it'll start to give a bit and it'll move a bit further and eventually settle at a value where it didn't start off. That's called creep. Mm-hmm. And you can actually model it. It's sort of a linear phenomenon in a way. You can model it. Whenever you model the low frequency characteristics of a loudspeaker, you can represent all the parts of a speaker, the mass, the compliances, the force, the resistance, as an equivalent electrical circuit. And this is what led to the Teal small parameters. They analyze it as an electrical circuit. And since we know how to model electrical circuits and their time response and their frequency response, if you convert a drive unit into an electrical circuit, you can use all the conventional techniques for analyzing electronic circuits that are the equivalent of the electromechanical characteristics of driver. So we can model the compliance of the spider as a mass in, well, there's two ways to do it, but in the analogies I use, as a mass. And if you want to apply creep, it's a mass in series with a mass, or an inductor, sorry. You can model the creep as an inductor, I mean. An inductor with creep, it's an inductor in series with an inductor in parallel with a resistor. So you've incorporated that into the equivalent circuit. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the effective compliance changes after you've stretched it. It'll partly settle back, but from the very first time, whatever its characteristics were, to the first time you start working it really hard, there will be a permanent change. It will never fully settle back to what it was before you started abusing it. And so what we recognize is, this isn't kind of an aspect that's up for discussion in the sense that some camps will believe it, some don't. It is the physics of how spiders work, and everyone accepts that. And whenever in the factory or in a lab we want to measure the Teal small parameters of a woofer, we would never take a fresh unit straight off the production line, put in a reasonably small signal so it just moves a little bit, and sweep it and calculate the parameters. We'd never do that. First thing we do is we work it. We run a very low frequency sine wave well below the resonant frequency, so we're in the stiffness controlled region, and we work it to, I don't know, centimeter peak to peak movement. And we choose a very low frequency so that we don't need too much power to get that excursion, so we're not heating everything up. But we'll run it for a few minutes, or at the very least, we'll keep doing high-level sweeps. You'll walk into a factory where they're testing drivers and developing drivers. You'll hear all around you, whoop, whoop, at very loud level, and they're doing it to just break in the driver. Then we measure the Teal small parameters. So break-in in that sense is real, and it has the effect of changing the effective stiffness of the spider, so it therefore shifts the resonant frequency. So an unbroken in woofer might be, let's say, 50 hertz. It could move it down to 40 hertz.
Wow.
Now, for once you put that into a box, either vented or closed box, if you put it into a closed box, generally you've arranged that the stiffness of the spider is, let's say, it's very loose compared to the stiffness of the box. So the box is the controlling stiffness. So now you've diluted the effects of a change in stiffness of the spider by some factor, maybe 5 to 1. But nonetheless, if you measured the low frequency response of a closed box with that woofer fresh, and then having done this working of the driver, and let it settle back so there's no temperature changes, you'll be able to measure a small change in low frequency response of the speaker. Question then is, does it ever go back to where it started with time? It certainly goes back a little, and you can detect that in a raw driver. And I'm saying, you know, in a closed box, it's usefully swamped, let's say, by the stiffness of the box. So the box takes control over most of that low frequency range. But nonetheless, technically, the low frequency response has changed. And if you leave it for a while, or you put it in a cold room or a hot room, compliances can change. And it can go back a little higher than what you'd forced it down to by work hardening, but it'll very rarely go back to the original fresh out of the box value.
But what you just described is over a very short period of time of working the driver, right? What if you put 5,000 hours on it, or 500 hours on it? There's
not, I think, much evidence that once you've gone past that first stage, that if you work it for 1,000 hours, that it will have permanently shifted it to an even lower value. You know, by working it, what you're saying is you've altered the characteristics of the spider permanently. Now, what are the factors involved in changing the stiffness permanently? You know, we know that any regular spring, if you stretch it too far, it will never go back. We go beyond the elastic limit, and then the elasticity has permanently changed. That's why your underpants no longer fit. It's not that you've lost weight. It's that your underpants are too old. So all springs have an elastic limit. And obviously, if we're really, really working a driver right up to the end stops a lot, there will be permanent changes in the spider. Now, I'm not saying that 1,000 hours of... I have to keep waving every so often. My room has got automatic lights, and you told me to stop moving my hands around. So there's nothing else to keep the lights on. What causes a change in the elasticity from fresh? Well, remember I said it's a doped cloth. It's a cotton type of material that's been formed into this corrugated, circular corrugated disc and soaked in a resin, bonding all the fibers together. And to some degree, the resin has bonded fibers into a tight community, let's say. And once you start working it, you will be breaking some of those bonds physically. Mm-hmm. And so it will soften up. The question is, once you've done it enough to begin with, does it matter how many extra hours you work it? Have you mostly done what you need to so that its characteristics don't change further? And for now, let's just imagine we can't take it so far outside of its elastic limit. We tend not to do that because we know that trying to stretch a spider that far, that's not just not good design practice, because you're not controlling the coil properly and it can rub and jump out of the gap and those kind of things. But nonetheless, the working will initially soften things up. Some of the stiffness, just a little, can come back. So every time you use it, I think you very quickly get back to regular used condition. Used speakers are a good idea.